I'm trying to find the manuscripts when I actually should be trying to find the people who owned the manuscripts. And that's where I really started to get a lot of really great results. So concentrating on where these things were passed through from hand to hand, through auction catalogues, through things like that, and searching the people, then I could find the stuff that they had in their collections.
Salutations and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are elated to talk with esoteric manuscript detective and researcher Daniel Clark. So, how do you track down hidden esoteric manuscripts? What are the secrets to working with libraries from across the world to unearth tomes that haven't been seen for hundreds of years? Who were the powerful, noble families who owned books of magic throughout the centuries? Well, manuscript detective and researcher Daniel Clark is the perfect person to ask. Daniel was born in Hobart, Tasmania, and he developed a serious interest in magic from a very early age with a particular focus on the grimoires. Daniel's interests range from Solomonic and Faustian traditions and demonology to the more obscure esoteric areas of Japanese Onmyodo and yokai mythology. Over the past few years, Daniel has been striving to help important and often forgotten manuscripts of magic get digitized and has tracked down and located many variant grimoires residing in universities and libraries around the world, many of which are still waiting to be rediscovered. In short, Daniel is known to many as the Sherlock Holmes of tracking down manuscripts, and he's co-authored many books with Dr. Stephen Skinner, including The Summa Sacra Magicae, or SSM, The Mysteries of Magic, The Ars Notoria, The Steganographia, and many more. Daniel is also an expert on tracing manuscript ownership and esotericism in the Victorian era. So in this episode, Daniel shares about his techniques for tracking down manuscripts. He shares about the Victorian esotericists working with Dr. Skinner on the Antipalus Maleficiorum, what the heck bookplates are and why they're so important, and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Daniel Clark. Daniel Clark, thank you so much for taking some time and stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you so much, Alex. Wow, that was an awesome introduction. How can I compete with that? That's really good. Thank you. It's kind of a surreal moment for me, actually, because I've been listening to your podcast for so long and now I'm actually on it. So it's kind of like a bit crazy.
Daniel, the honor is truly mine. And I'm actually a little nervous talking to you because talking to you is a little like, I don't know, talking to Neo from The Matrix or like a library interstellar space traveler, someone who really knows their way around the matrix of manuscripts. So the honor is certainly mine, Daniel. Absolutely.
Oh, you're too kind. I wish that was true, but it's very kind of you to say.
Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Tasmania and your early years? Can you share with us how and when did you develop an early interest in the grimoires?
Sure, yeah. When I talk to people in the States a lot of the time and they say, oh, where are you from? And I say, oh, I'm from Tasmania. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Where's that? So I probably should say for the listeners, and just in case anyone isn't familiar, Tasmania is an island state, the little triangle island just directly below Australia. So we're right down low on the map, right at the bottom of the planet. So it's a pretty isolated kind of place. It's kind of laid back and it was quiet and it was a good place to sort of grow up. I grew up in the country. It was good. When I was very young, I had an interest in supernatural and all those kind of associated things very much. Although I was a coward, I remember as a little kid watching Doctor Who from behind the couch and picking around the side with the strings. I was too scared, but my mother often reminds me of that. But sort of as I got a bit older, I sort of become more interested in the sort of more, I guess you could say, the serious side of the supernatural, I guess for lack of a better term. And then I started to get very, very interested in the concepts of the esoteric and the occult and spirits. I really had a thing, I really always was drawn to sort of more the darker aspects, I guess, of religion and the spirits and things like that, which is probably to my grandmother's fear, because my grandmother was my guardian for quite a large sum of my childhood. She was Anglican, not a devout Christian, but very much Anglican. So she must have been seeing my sort of interests and was horrified. But she never said anything about it, so she was good like that. Although I do remember getting very cross with me one day. She tried to take me to church, and I was very young. And even then I thought it didn't feel right for me. And I waited till she got out of the car, and then I locked all the doors, which was a terrible thing to do. But I had those sort of interests. But the problem living in Tasmania, resources or anything to do with the occult, there was nothing. There was nothing. You might find the occasional book in the shop on crystals or Wicca or stuff like that, but there was no real sort of more sort of serious elements to be found. In fact, I was going through an old shoebox downstairs I found, and I opened it up, and there was it was almost like a manuscript, because I found an old handwritten list of grimoires that I'd sort of lust after as a small child, and thinking to myself how cool it would be to have these. I must have read about them in sort of historic books or such. I don't remember where I got half the names from, to be honest now. But I always sort of dreamed of having those texts, and I thought, no, well, it's never going to happen. But it was kind of fun to go back through that. So, but then as I got a bit older, all the time I've been in Tasmania, I've never actually met anyone else who's sort of interested in the occult or even know what it was. And people say, well, what are you interested in? So, I'm interested in the occult. And they usually say, oh, what's that? Well, you tell them, and then they get the sort of horrified look on their face because they sort of don't understand. They think of, when you talk about the occult these days, people sort of think about Hollywood movies and things like that and get the wrong picture. But I remember there was a store on the mainland Australia called Ex Libris, and this was before the internet. And I remember writing letters away to this store, and there was a really, really nice gentleman who ran it, and I don't remember his name now. And he would send me back lists of what he had in stock, and I would order stuff, or I'd call him up each month and say, look, have you got this? And he'd say, no, I haven't, or I have got this. And so I started getting some more source material texts that way, like the Key of Solomon. And when the Megaton was the first book of it, the Goetia was published, I got that. And I sort of slowly built up a library there and just got more and more interested in it. So, but in short, I guess I've just always had that kind of inkling or that inclination towards the esoteric, and I really don't know why. I guess it was just something I was born with, so much to my grandmother's horror.
Was this interest, was it purely from a curiosity perspective? Was it a little bit about practicing? Was it more just an interest in research down the road, or was it a mix of all of these things together?
It's more of, it started off as a genuine interest. I remember, I must have been in my early teens. I grew up in the country, and I had an old barn out the back, and it had this old sort of loft above it. And I remember as a kid going out there one night, in the middle of the night, laying out the circle on the boards with chalk and doing a really, really pathetic attempt at a goetic experiment, which of course failed because I really had no idea what I was doing. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm so lucky that I was so inept then, because if I had a little bit more knowledge, I could have probably got myself in some really serious trouble there. But I just simply didn't know because I didn't have the resources to learn, or I didn't have anyone to show me. So I kind of fooled around with it in my teens, but then I sort of left that behind, and I got more interested into just the general study and the research. So I guess my interest is more from a research and interest to learn more and uncover more and kind of share what I can as well. So, yeah.
And this kind of leads, Daniel, to a first listener question that we have for you from McKinley Valentine, one of our awesome Glitch Bottle patrons. And McKinley is asking and saying, how did you, Daniel, get into this line of work? Did you start out as a more mainstream archivist?
I kind of just fell into it, I guess, for lack of a better term. I don't have any sort of formal education in being an archivist or a librarian or anything like that. It was just through my genuine sort of desire to try and find stuff and learn more about it. And as I sort of went along and met more people and got sort of a little bit more active in the current sort of occult community, opportunities happened, windows open, and I just kind of sort of fell into that kind of sort of situation. And I'm very, very lucky and very, very blessed like that, I guess. But yeah, so there was no real kind of desire initially I didn't have an ambition to become anything other than just going along and researching and just finding stuff out. So, yeah.
This is a question I know I got from a few people, and it's definitely been on my mind too. Can you share with us, Daniel? You are an esoteric detective. What was the first manuscript that you remember ever intentionally putting in effort and saying, I am going to track down this manuscript? Was there one that came to mind, or can you tell us a little bit about that?
I don't remember the first one I really actively searched out or I really wanted, but I remember the first one I got. I guess it was the one I must have been looking for at the time, and it was Chetham's Library manuscript, the Tractatus de Nigromantia, which was a 16th century pseudo-Bacon manuscript. And I had no idea what I was doing, absolutely no idea. So I went onto their website and filled out the application forms and such like, and they very, very kindly sent it to me and without any costs, which I was over the moon over. Back then, it wasn't available online. I think now it is. It's been uploaded, so if everyone can enjoy it. But I think from memory, yeah, that was the very, very first one I got, and that would have been almost 9 years ago, I guess.
Can you take us back to the kind of old school ways of tracking down a manuscript in years past? What were some of those old school techniques or ways to check out a potential manuscript in an actual library somewhere?
Sure, yeah. I mean, definitely a question that Steve can answer better than I can. I think he has talked about it in the past because he's actually had to go through those sort of processes where I haven't. Sadly, we don't have any large libraries where I am, so all my expertise with it is just been purely digital. But back in the old days, you would basically have to go in person, obviously, and go through all the old card catalogues and search out what you were looking for, or you have to go through the handwritten catalogues or the printed catalogues and try and find the shelf mark and what you were looking for. And it was quite a task. I mean, anyone who's even had to do it today can be just a nightmare trying to find a book amongst the ocean of others. So it was quite a feat. I love the story I think Stephen's told in the past where he would go in and he would have an old notebook that he would jot down everything that he needed to jot down in his manuscripts, and it was become very old and tatty. And on the way out, one of the librarians pulled him up and basically said, "What's that? What do you think you're doing?" Accusing him of stealing one of the manuscripts, which of course was not the case. But I believe also back in the day they had issues like basically would have to have people there watching because people would go in with straight razors and actually cut pages out of manuscripts and take them away and things like that, which is just horrific and selfish. But apparently that sort of thing did go on. But back in the day, it was all basically what I would call manual, in which you literally had to go on yourself and search through the card catalogues and search through the written catalogues and stuff like that to find what you're after. So it was quite a feat. I mean, I'm sure there were librarians that could assist you as well, but I could imagine the frustration of having to actually do that. It'd be cool, kind of, but it would also be frustrating. I mean, I know myself when I've gone to the University of Tasmania looking for stuff and just trying to find them on the shelves. I think I've walked around there for about 40 minutes once looking for something and just eventually found it, but it's not an easy feat. You can see how things get lost as well as a result.
So speaking of the great Dr. Stephen Skinner, you, Daniel, you've collaborated or co-authored actually several tomes with Dr. Skinner, including, I know listeners, you are so familiar with this, The Mysteries of Magic, The Arsenatoria, The Steganographia, books 1 through 4, and many others, of course. And can you share, Daniel, when did you first meet Dr. Stephen Skinner, and can you tell us about when you first collaborated with Dr. Skinner?
Sure. If someone said to me years ago that one day you'd be working with Dr. Stephen Skinner, I would have thought you were smoking crack. It was like, oh, no way. So I am so honoured and so blessed to have that opportunity. He's such a nice guy and he's such a mountain of information. I think of Stephen as sort of one of the last of the old school kind of magicians because he was just sort of there at the epicenter of everything and he knows everyone and he's so generous as well with his information and knowledge. So it's an absolute honour. I don't know why he puts up with me actually, but it all started, I guess, many years ago on Facebook. I had a public page, which was called the Spiritum Repositorium. And it just started off, it was just a little bloggy kind of thing where I'd post manuscripts that I found or I'd just write a little note about something or a thought on something, and people sort of started coming online with that and joining up. And that's, I think back there too, that's where I first met James Banner and we became good friends. James was the founder and owner of Trident Books. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago, but he was such a great guy too. And we used to have the best conversations. And he would always say to me, Daniel, you've got to get into publishing. You have to publish. And I'm like, come on, dude, you gotta be joking. I barely made it through school. Am I going to publish something? No way. He's like, no. And I remember he'd gotten a bit disheartened with his work because he was always criticized because the grimoires he were producing weren't academic works. People sort of missed the point. They were book art. His goal was to make beautiful grimoires the way that he thought they should have been made and the way they probably were made. So they were beautiful. I mean, Ars Obscura done the binding originally, and anyone who has a Trident leather bound, they know that it's really good quality binding and it's really good quality content as far as the way it's laid out and stuff like that. But anyway, and he'd seen stuff I'd been posting and he was interested, and he actually got that sort of spark back and he wanted to publish again. He wanted to make Trident come back, and he's asked if I would help him do a new version of the Grimoire of Pope Honorius and another Faustian text that he had. And I said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. Sadly, he passed away, but again, that manuscript didn't get done. I have it, so it'll be a future project, hopefully. But anyway, I'm digressing. I had all Stephen's Golden Horde books. I'd read them, and I loved them, and he was definitely one of my favourite authors. I remember asking him, email for a particular image, and which he very, very kindly sent me. And I guess we just started talking, and he may have requested a manuscript and I sent it to him, or I might have requested something from him. And we just started talking, and we kind of, I don't know, it just sort of went from there. We got to know each other and enjoyed the conversations, and he's just such a great guy, and it just sort of got along. And then I came across the Sibley Clavis in the National Library of Israel, and I was just blown away. It's still probably one of my absolute favourite Victorian grimoires. It was just so flamboyant and beautiful, and I love it. So I sent it to Stephen, and I said, you might want to check this out. It's beautiful, and which he did. And he said, oh, my God, we've got to publish this. And would you be interested in helping me? And I'm like, yeah. I was like, I couldn't believe I was asked. I was like, holy crap, yeah, yes, please. And so there we have it. And things have just gone on from there.
Oh, that's lovely. Yes. And listeners, this is, of course, and we've spoken with Dr. Skinner about this, the quote, Clavis or Key to Unlock the Mysteries of Magic by Rabbi Solomon, translated by Ebenezer Sibley, introduction by Dr. Stephen Skinner and Daniel Clark. This was in 2018. So that's when you came across this manuscript and you then started collaborating with Dr. Skinner. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. 2018. Wow. Jesus, where's the time going?
To that very point, Daniel, you started collaborating with Dr. Skinner. You have this amazing talent and expertise in terms of, finding manuscripts, discovering them, tracking things down. Can you share with the listeners, what are some of your techniques over the years that you've kind of honed for being a manuscript seeker, finder, manuscript detective, as I would say? And can you share about the techniques, maybe the joys of being a manuscript seeker, and maybe some of the disappointments? I mean, anything and everything that you'd like listeners to know.
Sure. It really is 50-50 in regards to finding stuff. So it's like 50% research and 50% searching stuff out. And then there's also a modicum of just plain good luck. I can't tell you how many times I've actually stumbled on stuff when I'm looking for something completely unrelated. So you get that as well. But the biggest thing you've got to have is patience. I mean, I've sat in front of digital catalogues and I've gone through every single listing. I've sat down in front of physical catalogues and I've gone through every single listing looking for stuff. And that's a very long-winded way of doing it. So I don't do that all the time, but it just depends if there's something that I'm particularly after. But you've got to sort of start to think in different ways as too. If you're looking on search engines like the digital catalogues and stuff like that, I mean, you're looking for a Key of Solomon. You can type in Key of Solomon, and you'll get some hits, and mostly reprinted stuff like that. But then you type in the Clavicula Salomonis, and you'll get more sort of manuscript related hints. But then there's variations on the spelling. So you've got to start looking at that. And then you've got to start looking, perhaps using other words, and different variations like the Magi and Magi and different spellings, different kind of sort of combinations of words. Sometimes you just take crab shots and just type in a word and I hope you'll get something back on that. So there's all those kind of sort of different aspects. You've got to look at it from lots of different angles. And I used to do that, and I still do. But then as I've gone on, my perspective has changed and I sort of start to realize I'm doing this wrong. I'm trying to find the manuscripts when I actually should be trying to find the people who owned the manuscripts. And that's where I really started to get a lot of really great results. So concentrating on where these things were passed through from hand to hand, through auction catalogues, through things like that, and searching the people then I could find the stuff that they had in their collections. And I found some amazing stuff through old auction catalogs and stuff that have just like, you're looking for a Key of Solomon and you're going down the list and this person's probably got like 5 of them, and then they've got something that's just like you've never heard of before, or they've got a Hockley manuscript I've been after. I'm like, holy crap, this guy had that and stuff like that. So I found that sort of is more the crux of getting the stuff, is not finding the manuscripts, find the people who own them, and then the manuscripts will actually come to you. Kind of, I guess that's sort of a romanticized way of putting it, but it seems to be the case.
So for all of the listeners out there who might use a digital catalog, and they're maybe even looking for a well-known grimoire like the Clavicula Salamanus, as you said, or the Lemegeton's Goetia, or the Elucidarium Necromantiae, whatever it is, I didn't even think about that, but it makes total sense. Like spellings, like there is not one particular spelling, and is that because, these are just found, they're just written differently, or maybe someone picking up the manuscript and putting it into the digital catalog might type it in a different way? Or can you give us some of the background behind this like variation in the spelling?
Yeah, well, you've got variations of spelling with the French, and you've got Italian versions and stuff like that. So a lot of it is the language where it's been translated and stuff like that, or it's the Latin, or it's a particular family class of claviculus. They've got the different kinds, so they have different titles and different spellings and that. And then sometimes it might just be error. There's one manuscript I know that was actually catalogued. The person who's put it in has made a mistake and give it a completely wrong title, which means it won't come up in a search engine unless you use other terms associated with it. So, yeah, it's just a matter of thinking a little bit outside the box when it comes to the names. Yeah, you'll get more hits.
All right, so you are so good at this, being the manuscript detective, and given the tips that you've just shared, can you share with us what is one catalog entry that might come to mind that totally did not at all reflect the esoteric gems, if you will, of the manuscript itself? Is there anything that's coming to mind for you?
That's a good question. There's probably been a lot, if I'm honest, because I've got that many in my collection now. I'm so lucky to have found a lot of the stuff. Probably one that comes to mind was there was one in Harvard University, and it had a title that was something like, it was in French, and I think it translated to a speech made to the king by Abdallah, ambassador of Morocco, or something like that. I'm just like, you look at anything, okay, well, whatever. And then I'm looking at it, and I've gone through it. I was just curious. And then bang, smack in the middle of it, there was the Grimoire of Pope Honorius. It was like, huh? What? So it's amazing, like things that can get bound in with other stuff. And they may have been related. I mean, I don't speak, for anyone listening, fortunately, I can only speak English. I don't know any other languages. I wish I did. I wish I could speak Latin like you can, Alex. You're fantastic at it. But even my pronunciations are probably terrible because where I live, I don't get to talk about this with anyone. I'm reading this, but they're actually saying a lot of these words, which is kind of bizarre. But there's no sort of community here locally that I can talk about with this stuff with. But anyway, so yeah, in bang smack in the middle of that, there was this Grimoire of Pope Honorius. It was quite an unusual one too. I think I sent that to Mihai, and he done a write-up on it a while back. He done a good job with that. So there was that. I think more I've ordered something and then been surprised that it wasn't quite, well, it was as the description says it was, but they had no idea who it was from. And that was the case with the Society of Antiquities. There was a very sort of vague catalogue description. It was the Goetia, the first book of the Goetia. And I thought, oh, this was really cool. And it was by a guy who owned it. I don't think he didn't write it, but he owned it. And there's a guy called Arthur Ashpital. And he was a really interesting fellow, actually, because he was a prominent architect. His father was an architect as well. Actually, I've got his father's bookplate in my collection. He followed his father's footsteps, and he was a prominent architect in London. He designed a lot of stuff, and he was a very, very good artist, and doing lithographs and such like. He moved to Rome, and then he got malaria and had to come back. But he also cast the ornament on the Westminster Bill. He was responsible to do the casting of that as well. So he was interested in collecting books and stuff. Anyway, so I ordered this manuscript, and I got it, and I looked at it, and as soon as I saw the title page, my jaw just dropped. So I knew straight away it was a Hockley. And I thought, holy crap. And they had no idea. I mean, why would they? I mean, Hockley wasn't really a big name to them. So it was one of the ones, and I imagine it was one of the ones that Danley had commissioned him, because it was the only Goetia manuscript I've seen by Hockley that's complete. All the other examples are incomplete with sigils missing or stuff like that, but this one is complete. So I imagine it's one that Denley commissioning to do and was sold, or maybe Ashpiddle got it from Hockley. I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah, so I wrote back to the library and said, look, this is from this person, blah, 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 this is who he is. And the librarian was so happy, and they said, fantastic, can we use this in our catalogue? And I said, sure, absolutely. And then the librarian promptly left. So it was never actually used, and to this day, it's still the same listing. So that was really, really cool. The other one, what I was talking about earlier, was the Ferguson manuscript in the University of Glasgow. The listing was chirurgia, which basically I think actually means like is someone who practices surgery or the art of surgery or something. The title of the manuscript is chirurgia, and then it's got a description as, I think from memory, like the theurgia containing the magic and magical elements of Peter the Urbano. I thought, well, that's a bit odd. I ordered that, and it turned out that was actually another manuscript that wasn't written by Hockley, but was owned by him. What I imagine has happened is when I've put the catalogue listing in, the librarian has the title in Hockley, in the Hockley one is very flamboyant. And I imagine that the catalogue has misread it. It's meant to say theurgia, and they've misread it, and they've broke down chirurgia, if that's pronounced. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's Chirurgia. So they kind of mucked up the title completely. So that was an interesting find. That manuscript was a nightmare to try and obtain. That was I think I might have mentioned it to you a while back, Alex. It was one of these libraries where they would only let you have 50 pages at a time. No more. 50 pages at a time. So I would order 50 pages. And the manuscript itself, it's got some great stuff in it. It really has. It's got the art of Cyprian in the back, and it's got some John Dee stuff, and really, really great. So I'd order 50 pages from this manuscript. Then I'd wait 6 to 8 months till they forgot about me. And then I'd go back and I'd order another 50 pages. And I'd wait for another 6 months until they forgot about me. And so on. So it took me years. So I eventually got it all, and I digitally stitched it together, and I've got a complete copy of it. But I really hate it when libraries do that. It's just a nightmare. So that's some of the occasions where, you find some interesting stuff. Ordering manuscripts is like I've mentioned before, it's like Russian roulette. You're going on the description, or a gut feeling, you don't know what you're going to get. Sometimes libraries will give you, you can ask for a sample image and they'll send it to you. A lot of the time they won't, or whatever. And sometimes you can pay big money to have something photographed, and then when you get it, it's like, oh man, this is not what I was hoping for. And you feel deflated and a bit depressed, but it doesn't really matter in the long term because they're all important, regardless. They're all filling in the little pieces. So whether it's a flamboyantly lavish illustrated, Key of Solomon or a necromantic manuscript, or it's just a basic thing with just a couple of little sigils and right. At the end of the day, it's all filling in the pictures, and it's all important, regardless.
When you would immediately see this manuscript or come into contact with it one way or another, you would immediately spot this totally out of the blue, if I'm understanding right, as a manuscript that belonged to Hockley, which for the listeners, I know you're familiar, but for those who aren't, Frederick Hockley was a British occultist and a scryer who was, a London-based Freemason, and also transcribed and collected a huge library of important occult books. So, what is that feeling like when you stumble upon something like that?
Yeah, well, anyone who knows me knows I'm probably one of the biggest Hockley fanboys you'll ever meet. I'm obsessed with the man. I just love his stuff. So I know his calligraphy straight off the bat as soon as I see it. Same with Irwin. And it's like a rush. Like, literally my heart is pounding out of my chest. I'm that excited. Like, I've jumped out of my chair in excitement when I've seen stuff like that. The thing I really enjoy about manuscripts and getting manuscripts is I love them. I love looking at the calligraphy and stuff like that. And I love them as a piece of art. But that rush you get when you're finding something that maybe no one's seen in such a long time, and just be able to see the work and the thought that's gone into it and the actual techniques and processes it's talking about as well, of course. It's an addiction. It really is. Unfortunately for me, it's an expensive addiction, which is why I'm really always broke. But I just love it. I really do.
To that very point, Daniel, when it comes to digital resources and online resources, of course, I'm thinking about the wonderful esotericarchives.com from the excellent luminary Joseph H. Peterson. But we have a listener question for you from McKinley Valentine again, who is asking, are there any online resources, Daniel, you think people are sleeping on beyond sacredtext.com, let's say?
Well, Joe's work on the Twilight Grotto is fantastic. He's been in there for a long time and making a lot of stuff accessible to people. So, kudos to him. It really is. That's the starting point, I think, for anyone who really wants to get into manuscripts, and learning about them is a good starting point. But it's interesting because as the internet goes on, sites come and sites go, and there's always new sites coming up. A lot of the time, I really just go through the actual catalogues. But there are search engines that you can have, like Archive Grid is good. I've used that. There's Europeana, Digital Handschriften. Handschriften is the German word for manuscript. There's another one, oh God, I have used it in the past and I cannot pronounce its name. So forgive me, Manuscripta Medievalia, or something along those lines. That's not too bad if you're looking for the more of the earlier stuff. So there are manuscript search engines coming online all the time. Some of them are still prototyped. They're not that effective. Some are better than others. Some I would caution against because they actually have a lot of bootleg material. You know, they're illegally posting stuff that's been published that they shouldn't be. So I'm not going to mention those. But I've used Archive Grid a bit, and I've got some really good hits off that. So that's one I could probably recommend for someone starting out.
When I'm thinking, Daniel, of, for instance, the Vatican, apparently in recent years, right? And I know I've spoken with Joseph H. Peterson about this too, but, you know, they're digitizing, you know, a ton of manuscripts. They've been doing that over the recent years. And is that kind of the trend around the world, like broadly speaking, that some of these libraries, of course, not all of them, but some of them are slowly trying to digitize collections? Or is it kind of, it totally depends on the library and it depends on what they're doing?
I must admit, the Vatican one did surprise me. I didn't think they'd ever digitize a lot of the stuff that they have. It's a bit of a sort of a website. It's not their search engine is not that great. That's one of the ones I've literally gone through almost, you know, by entry, and I've actually found a couple of really cool manuscripts there over the past. So I think there was an Armadale and a couple of others. I'm very interested to see in the future what they do upload, what they're willing to upload, because I'm sure they've probably got stuff that they're still pretty, I don't think we should put that out to the public kind of thing. But I think they're certainly a lot more open-minded than in the past. That's for sure. I guess it's supply and demand. They get so many queries at certain websites or certain libraries, they may put search engines out. So time will tell. Things come and go, basically.
I always take notes because I always learn so much from awesome guests like yourself during the podcast. And I have notes when it comes to tips. One is check alternate spellings and check on the search engine and check with the library. But in terms of other tips, we also, Daniel, to that very point, have a listener question for you from McKinley Valentine, who is asking, how might amateur researchers go about requesting to look at a manuscript that's not currently on display? Can you just ask, or do you need qualifications?
No, you don't need qualifications, although perhaps once upon a time you did. The hardest part is just learning how to navigate the websites, and they're all a bit different. The actual hardest part is finding someone to talk to that's in the right department. And if you're going through one of the larger libraries, you can sometimes get shuffled from one email to another until they get to the person that you need to speak to. So you would basically inquire. You need to give them, obviously, the name of the manuscript you're after and the shelf mark and a brief description, and then you would have to inquire, can it be digitized? A lot of the places can, but some can't. And then they would send you a request form that you have to fill out. Then you would send that back in, and then they will send you out a payment. They will give you a quote, generally, on how much it's going to cost to have it photographed. Unfortunately, that can be very expensive, and sometimes it can't. It depends on the library again. And then basically you just have to wait. So it's like any sort of application. You fill out the form, tick all the right boxes, get the stamp of approval, and then you wait for them to do the photography, and then they will send you the images. So anyone can do it, but it can be a little bit daunting if you haven't done it before. But it's, you know, once you've done it once or twice, it's okay. It can be frustrating. Patience is the biggest thing you'll ever need if you want to search for manuscripts or you want to request manuscripts. The longest I've waited is for something to be done was twice I've had to, over a year for something to be done. That library was, they were different. I won't mention their name, but they were different to work with. And the other one I requested was the Hockley crystal manuscripts, which was done by, I can't think of the name of the place. Yeah, sometimes you have to wait quite a bit of time. Library of Congress, that was the one I was thinking of, yeah.
Daniel, to that point too, McKinley Valentine's asking, has a newly unearthed manuscript ever dramatically changed your understanding of the text, or is it more filling in gaps?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess that's a very subjective question because it really depends on what you're working on. Lots of people are working on lots of different sort of aspects of Solomonic magic and Faustian and stuff like that. So it's going to be different for every individual. For me, I think I probably have. Nothing comes to mind off the bat, but it's, for me, I guess it's more filling in the gaps and seeing variations. Like, and sometimes they can be really quite artistic variations of pentacles. Like the Ibit manuscript has some sort of pentacles and things in it that have art that I haven't seen before. Now, whether they're variations or whether they're sort of artistic flair, that can be the case as well. So I kind of enjoy sort of seeing the differences between the scribes and what they're doing. And then, of course, you can see what the content is, what this has and what this one doesn't have, what's been left out, what's been included. So you got all these variations that I enjoy. So putting the pieces back in that picture, as Dr. Skinner also often says, you're putting all the parts back together, or trying to, because as has been mentioned by many people, it's an incredibly fragmented history. So any little chink in the puzzle you can put back is a bonus. It's a very, very slow process.
Well, thanks to your efforts and Dr. Stephen Skinner and David Rankin and Joseph H. Peterson and Mihai Vartajaru and many others, Brian Johnson, this select few of amazing scholars and researchers, I know that we're all so thankful, Daniel. And to your point as well about the Vatican, let's say, this leads to the next question, which is, what are some of the biggest libraries or collections of manuscripts out there that people don't usually think about? Like, I always imagine, and you will totally laugh here, but I always imagine, there's some European castle somewhere in Central Asia that just has a giant warehouse of manuscripts that's totally not translated yet, and everyone's just licking their chops, just waiting to translate it. I'm sure that's not how it is at all, but can you tell us the real answer, please?
So you're making me drool just thinking about it, actually. Stop it. Most of the big libraries, I mean, I'm sure the listeners know about it. Of course, you've got Wellcome, the British Library, and Rittman and places like that, and Leipzig and stuff. But there's other places like the Black Diamond. That's got some great stuff in it. Yeah, there's lots of big places that have manuscripts. And in Europe, I'm sure that there are libraries that are insanely old. But the problem you have when something like in Italy and places like that, the problem you'll have with those, and the problem I've encountered in the past, is obviously the language barrier, which is quite difficult. But besides that, is a lot of those old libraries that have those massive collections and stuff do not have the facilities to digitize of photographs. And I've encountered that before. I've actually found stuff. I think when we were working on the Ars Notoria, they had a wonderful manuscript there. I forget the name, the shelf mark or anything, but I requested photography and they said, look, we don't have those facilities, or we don't have enough staff. You are welcome to hire a photographer and have them go in and do it for you, but you can imagine the cost of that. So unless you can physically go there yourself, those sort of avenues are a little bit outside my reach at this point in time, and not unless I win the lotto and I can afford a trip to go there. Some of the Russian libraries have some fantastic stuff, and in more recent years, they've started making those public, digitizing and stuff like that. But I've found what you were saying earlier actually is actually correct. It's the smaller libraries and those estate homes that actually have gems. And some of those libraries can be quite big. I mean, I found in Chatsworth Library, Chatsworth is a beautiful manor estate, and I think people can go there and have functions and stuff like that. But they have a library there, and I actually found a Clavicular Solemnis there. Unfortunately, again, they didn't have the facilities to photograph it, but the librarian very kindly took some sample photos with a phone and sent to me. So personally, I think it's the smaller collections is where you'll find the real little hidden gems, the stuff that just gets overlooked because everyone goes to the big libraries. And yes, the big libraries have great stuff, but let's not forget the smaller ones. And in those old English manor homes and stuff like that, where those libraries are, that's where the stuff can be found. Unfortunately, with Alan Wick, sometimes the collections get sold off. I mean, they sold their collection of occult manuscripts, which I thought was just shocking. That library's been together for a long time, and because the librarians, whatever, they maybe need some money, and it's the cult, esoteric, they're not interested in it. I think no one else is interested, so they auction them off. It doesn't happen often, but it does. Thankfully, UPenn bought all those and digitized them all, so there was a shining light at the end of that. So, yeah, it happens.
That, to me, Daniel, just hearing you share that goes directly to this kind of overarching theme of yourself and others connecting the dots and really trying to restore that tradition of esoteric manuscripts, research, the grimoires, Solomonic traditionalism, all of that. And this actually goes to a point that you brought up earlier, which is it's not only about the manuscripts, it's about the people who owned the manuscripts. Can you tell us, Daniel, about just some of the fascinating owners of these critical, vital manuscripts and your efforts to catalog them, because I know that that is a huge area of focus for you as well.
Well, as we touched on earlier, my main man is Frederick Hockley. About eight years ago, I mean, very few people had heard of Hockley. He was just an unknown sort of name, and he's become like a celebrity in the occult world, I'd like to think anyway. He's sort of become more and more popular as a lot of different academics and stuff have started talking about him. Became particularly sort of more renowned when Theatin started publishing his works. And the bad side is that now his manuscripts, on the rare occasions they do come up for sale, are very expensive and nearly impossible to obtain. My life ambition is to own a Hockley manuscript, but sadly, financially, that's never going to be the case. But Fred, he was really a major player through the Victorian period. I won't go into saying too much because there's already been so much spoken about him and written about him already. I'm sure most of the listeners are probably familiar. But basically, he made a career almost, although he was an accountant officially, his side job, for lack of a better term, was transcribing manuscripts. And he had probably one of the best collection and varied collection for quite some time. Yeah, he was incredibly generous too with his knowledge. He would send manuscripts to friends to copy and make them direct copies and then would send back to him. In his younger days, he worked for Denley, who was a bookstore owner in Covent Garden, and he would make copies of manuscripts for his Denley's patrons and stuff. He was a machine. He was pumping out so much stuff. And think to date, I've identified about 98 manuscripts that were in his collection, with probably about 75% of those actually being transcripts by Hockley himself. So I'm always on the hunt. And he's had a unique way of doing his designs and his illustrations and drop caps and the most brilliant title pages. His book of the Moths has a fantastic title page. But I was speaking with some people from Saria recently, and they very kindly sent me some information that they had on Hockley, because they've actually got a scrying mirror that people are saying belonged to Fred Hockley. And I've got a suspicion that it's probably belonged to Irwin. So I've been trying to actually get photographs of that, but unfortunately it seems to have been spirited away and no one really wants to talk much about that. But he was always moving around. He used to always complain about moving the chore of moving his library. He was a fantastic guy, very, very high up in Masonic, and he was held very high regard with the Rosicrucians as well. So a fantastic guy. Hockley's best friend was probably a guy called Francis George Irwin, who was Captain Irwin officially, and then was granted the honorary title of Major. So most people sort of would read the name as Major Irwin. He was an amazing fellow as well, very much into the occult and the spiritualism side, and prolific writer of Masonic texts. He was very high-ranking in the Freemasons, even though he was regarded as doing what they call fringe masonry, which was sort of magical trappings. That was a little bit frowned on, but he was still held in high regard. Same with Oakley. He was basically Hockley's best friend, and in fact, Irwin was the only person who got the privilege of seeing some of Hockley's crystal manuscripts. Now, the crystal manuscripts were Hockley's absolute personal records of everything he was doing as far as scrying and experiments. He would not show those to anyone. That was like absolute taboo. And Irwin was probably one of the few people that got to see a sample of it. And he was given that on the pretext that he wasn't to copy it, and he was a bit naughty, and he did. But anyway, Irwin, he amassed a pretty good collection of manuscripts concerning magic and alchemy and such like. Irwin's, his stuff is pretty easy to identify as well, like Hockley's, because he had a rather unique calligraphy. It was very small and very tight calligraphy. The only book on magic that's written by Irwin that's been published was the one done by Esoteric Endeavour. Oh, when was that? Oh, I can't remember what year. It was a long time ago, and that was the Irwin Book of Magic. When he done that book, he wrote it up as being written by Herbert Irwin. Herbert Irwin was Francis's son. I saw it online. I saw pictures of this manuscript that had been owned at the time. I'm looking at it, I thought, something doesn't seem right. I'm looking at it, and I thought, because I actually commissioned the photography of a manuscript that is by Herbert Irwin, which was in Cleveland. It was a work on the true work of the Jesuits or something. It was in the Cleveland Public Library, and I got that photographed. And Herbert Irwin's calligraphy is very rough and loose and large, and wasn't what was in this manuscript. So I knew that the Museum of Freemasonry had lots of examples of Irwin's handwriting. So I ordered a manuscript on the Frederick Lucius, which is an organisation that he created, or only an expansion of an organisation that he created. And they sent me some samples, and sure enough, the handwriting is exactly the same that was in that Irwin Book of Magic. So the Irwin Book of Magic that's been published is actually by senior, not junior. So Francis Irwin, he created the Frederick Lucius organisation, and it had a few members. I don't think it was particularly large. That was one of the only magical societies that Frederick Hockley joined, because he wasn't really into that. Like, he liked to practice solo. He wasn't into sort of communal stuff, but he joined that probably out of friendship and respect to Irwin than anything else. And William Wayne Westcott, also requested to be a member of the Frederick Lucius, but was denied. I can't remember the story now off the top of my head, but be that as it may, Westcott and Irwin were good friends. They had a lot of correspondence, and I like to think that probably one of the most leading individuals that helped with the formation of the Golden Dawn was Major Irwin, and to Hockley to some degree with some of the writings. But I think Irwin had a very big influence on Westcott, and of course, Westcott went on to be one of the founding members of the Golden Dawn. But I saw, of course, people who are more into that could give you better information than I can on that. So, an interesting individual. Very hard to find manuscripts on magic by Irwin. He did do them, but they're not out there. They're all probably in public collections. I know of 3 examples of his magical manuscripts that are written by him only, but I'm always on the hunt for more. Now, one of the other guys that people may not have heard of is another guy I'm extremely interested in. It was a guy by the name of Walter Moseley, Esquire. Outside of Fred Hockley, he had probably one of the best collections of grimoires and manuscripts of that period. It was fantastic. He actually ended up with a lot of Hockley's manuscripts once Hockley passed away and they went to auction. But he was a really interesting fellow. He was associated his family for generations associated with Buildwas, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, so I apologise to any of the British listeners. It was an ancient parish located in the town of Shropshire. But the family's been in there for generations. It was crazy. So, but what was interesting about Irwin was whereas Hockley and Francis and a lot of the other people in that particular period they were about spiritualism, working with crystals and things like that, whereas Moseley wasn't. He was actually more into the Solomonic, and that was very rare for that period of time. He actually died young, and the rumour was it was a result of poisoning during one of his experiments in the dark arts. So it was interesting. And Arthur Edward Waite, and I've got a little note, where was it? He when he's speaking of it, he says, Waite, and I quote, "Moseley was like his predecessor Hockley, what is called a practical student, but whereas Hockley appears to have been content with employing clairvoyant subjects, scries and crystals, and persons who could be passed into magnetic trance, Moseley is said to have tried more dangerous paths." And so basically Waite was the one who said that this is basically what happened. He heard that he killed himself accidentally during some sort of experiment, but he also went on to say that he heard that information secondhand. So, we don't know if that's true or not. Maybe not. But the cool thing was with Moseley also is where he lived, the estate that he had also had an old ruined abbey. I wonder if he actually used that as a base for guiding experiments or whatever else he was into. So identifying a Moseley manuscript was not too hard in that he was very knowledgeable. But he had a habit of correcting the mistakes that have been written in manuscripts, which is good in that he's corrected the mistakes, and the corrections he made were correct, and bad kind of scribbling all over them. But you could tell because he would cross out the word that was incorrect and he would write in the correct word, and he had a very sharp, angular handwriting. I think he had about 3 Sibley clavices in his collection, and one of them is in Rittman, and I'm pretty sure it's his. Well, I know it's his because you can see the corrections written in it. So that makes finding his stuff a bit easier. He also had a really cool Key of Solomon. It was in Brown University, I think. Yeah, that was one of his. That was actually really cool because that one, I think it was actually appears to possibly be a transcript made from Sibley's original. And it was cool because it had a reputation on campus. Apparently the rumour started going around a day that it was bound in human skin. And this rumour began getting more and more momentum. And then they finally thought, oh, God, and when they done a peptide test, and it turned out it wasn't, it was calf, but it was kind of cool because it was like the Necronomicon of the campus. But that was one of the manuscripts that took me a long time to get as well. So it was a cool one. But yeah, Moseley, great. I hope to be able to do more work with him in the future. And one of the big boys is John Somers, Lord Somers. If it wasn't for Somers, we wouldn't have half the stuff we've got now. And certainly the British Library would not have half the stuff they've got now. Somers was a big name. He was in the political circles. He has a massive political career, which I won't go into because it's not my thing. But he was also, I think from memory, embroiled in a couple of scandals there, not intentionally. I think he was one of the ones who was involved with the William Kidd caper, in which they got together and they hired a captain, William Kidd, to go and fight piracy in the Indian Oceans. And apparently Kidd went out and done that and decided, oh, this is a bit of all right, and actually turned into a pirate himself, or was coerced into turning into a pirate and became, Captain Kidd, the semi-famous pirate that career didn't end well for him when he was put in the gibbet and died. But again, I digress. But he was an avid reader, he was an avid writer, and an avid collector, a total bibliophile. And he amassed a massive collection. He was also very much into magic. Though he didn't travel, he was wealthy, and he would commission people to find stuff for him. And so he amassed a massive collection of magical manuscripts. When he passed, they went to his son-in-law, Joseph Jekyll. On the occasions that I have spoken about Jekyll, usually the first question I get asked is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I'm like, well, yes and no. There was a Jekyll that was known to Robert Louis Stevenson, who was friends with him, but there was a different Jekyll, a different bloodline. And actually, he used that Jekyll as the name, the basis for his character in his book, but that's a different one. But anyway, Jekyll inherited Somers' collection. Did Somers practice magic? Don't know. Can't say I wasn't there, but I tend to lean towards probably not. I think he was more of a collector and an interest in it. I don't know. I don't think Joseph Jekyll was interested in magic at all. To his favour, he kept the collection intact, but he never actually added to it. You just get the impression that he wasn't that into that kind of thing, but he kept the collection all the same. When Jekyll died, it all went to auction and was bought by Hans Sloane, who basically was the founder of what was then the British Museum, which is now the British Library. And so nearly all those manuscripts are still there today as known as the Sloane manuscripts. So I've connected from the Somers original catalogue to the Jekyll catalogue, and then I've linked to where they are now and which Sloane manuscript they are. And 95% of them are there, with the exception of one or two I can't find. They're either being miscatalogued or perhaps Hans Sloane didn't get them at auction or whatever. I don't know. Those two gentlemen indeed are massively important to the history of magic. Somers for collecting it, Jekyll for keeping it, and of course Sloane for buying it and making it accessible to the public. Another person is Thomas Britton, the small coal man, which very few people may have heard of. He was a charcoal merchant. He was someone who definitely practiced magic. He travelled around, he collected manuscripts here, there and everywhere. When he started travelling abroad, he sold most of his collection because he either wanted funds, we didn't want any more, he was travelling, whatever. And then after he passed away, there was a separate auction again, and the rest of his stuff was sold. And that auction, from memory, has probably the best listing I've ever seen in my life, in which it gives a very, very detailed account of a complete manuscript of the Megaton and all the equipment he used to practice. So it has like the circle written on parchment, glued on vellum, rolled up, and all the paraphernalia and all the equipment was all sold as one lot. And I've never, ever seen that before. So that was pretty cool. And there was talk also that Somers may have bought a lot of the manuscripts from Britain when he sold them in that first catalogue, or actually, although I have a feeling he sold them privately because a lot of stuff isn't listed, but I have heard that sort of scenario put forward, but I need to research that a bit more. So yeah, Thomas Britton was another one. Richard Cosway, he was possibly one of the founding members of the Mercury. Richard Cosway was famous for being a miniature portrait painter, and if you've ever seen his stuff, it's really cool. Tiny, itty-bitty little paintings and very, very detailed. He was immensely interested in magic. I believe he was a practitioner. He got together a pretty damn good collection. He was also very much a dandy, and he would often, I believe, paint himself very much romanticised, whereas the real Cosway was very much more plain, I think, in real life. But so that's kind of fun. And sadly, when he passed away and his catalogue of books went to auction, the person who made that catalogue was exceptionally lazy and didn't catalogue the names of a lot of the manuscripts. So they would just put as lots of, 12 manuscripts concerning magic was one lot, and another 8 manuscripts concerning magic, and didn't actually say what they were. But I think Cosway was also, he was one of the owners of the Folger manuscript, the Book of Oberon, from memory, I think. So, yeah, he was a very, very, very important individual. George Oakley Fisher, another name that people may or may not be familiar with. He was a collector of fine art and antiquities who also liked to collect books. I've got a few manuscripts with his bookplate in the front of it that he's had his collections, like from Key of Solomon. And it's one of those names that just pops up all the time. You said, oh, it's a Fisher manuscript, and then you sort of forget about it again. So he's another person definitely worth noting. He was also very much into armorial heraldry, and he'd done the best armorial book bindings, personalised bindings with his crest stamped on the front. There was a collection come up not that long ago, a full set of books unrelated to magic, but it was the coolest binding. So he was very much into that. The one name that did surprise me, and you say it, and people's like, "Oh, come on, you're joking, aren't you?" And that's Harry Houdini. You're like, "Oh, really?" But Harry Houdini was immensely interested in magic, and he amassed a fantastic collection because he was in circumstances where he was traveling all around the world doing his act and whatever. So he was always on the move, and he was always adding to his collection. But Harry Houdini wasn't a practitioner of magic. He was very much more like Harry Price, who was the British psychic researcher, and he was out to discredit magic or prove it fraudulent. And until his ends, he would collect stuff and read about it. And so he had the concept, the ideas. He knew what the play was, and he was out to sort of prove that it wasn't real. So, but his collection, most of it it was bequeathed to the Library of Congress, but some of it I think went to the University of Texas, where I also found a few more Hockley manuscripts. He got a lot of Hockley manuscripts. Lucky guy. Yeah, it's one of those names you sort of don't associate with. You obviously associate with stage illusions and stuff like that, but you don't associate him with actual magic. And I was quite surprised back in the day to find out that, yes, he was interested, albeit from a different perspective, but amassed a fantastic collection all the same. I could go on and on and on, but there's just so many. So that's just sort of a brief overview of some of the ones that I'm interested in.
I would have never thought Harry Houdini would have owned, a massive amount of occult manuscripts, whether he's trying to disprove it or not. That is so fascinating.
Yeah. He got the choicest of the choice Hockley manuscripts. I don't know where the hell he got them from, but man, that was the mother lode, and I'm extremely jealous.
I know, and just hear you describe that about the close misses, the unexpected huge rediscoveries of a manuscript, just the highs and the lows of being a manuscript detective seems to be ubiquitous with everything going on.
Yeah, well, I was really lucky. I mean, I contacted the Library of Congress when I realised that they had them. And I said, look, this is the situation. These are the manuscripts. What can we do? And because it would literally, to have those photographed, it would have cost probably, for me, because the Australian dollar is really bad as well, probably, nearly $10,000. It was an obscene, because we were talking about, it was 14 volumes, and they were large, thick volumes. And so I talked to the library and said, look, how about this? If you're willing to wait, we're in the process of digitizing a lot of stuff. We'll digitize them for you, and then we'll let you know when they're available and they're uploaded. And I said, thank you so much. And it took them about a year to do it. And then they made it public, that and one of the other Hockley manuscripts. The thing was, they had no idea. They had no idea who they were from. When I explained it to them, and they sort of knew, and then they started doing their own research, and then they realised how valuable they are. And since then, I've actually made videos on YouTube about those manuscripts and stuff like that. I forget the librarian's name; she was lovely. So I'm pleased that they now realise the worth of what they've got. They've also got a collection of scrapbooks by Irwin, which I'd love to get photographed, but again, I don't think I'm going to be able to afford them. They're more just newspaper clippings and things of interest that Irwin liked, and just stuck into these really crudely made books that I think he made them himself. They're very crude, but they look interesting. So I would love to see those in the future as well. So, yeah.
What could libraries do better overall to make manuscripts more accessible? And here's my list so far based on our conversation. Don't put a 50-page limit on requesting pages. Number one, and force someone like you or anyone else to wait, like a year, 6 months to a year so they can forget about you. And then you have to request another. That's one I have. The other is what the Library of Congress did, digitize those or at least, save individuals, thousands and thousands of dollars by trying to digitize those. But what are some other things that you think, pun fully intended, if you had a magic wand, what could libraries do better to make manuscripts more accessible?
Drop their damn prices.
No, touché.
Look, I understand it. One of those things is they have to pay the staff. The staff are probably overworked. They don't have a lot of time. They've probably got, hundreds of thousands of requests. So I understand all that kind of thing. I think some of them are greedy in the prices. Some of the prices are really, really expensive, considering that it's digital now. I can understand if it was film or whatever. So I really do think maybe that some of the prices are too over the top. In fact, some of them are so expensive you just simply can't get them. I mean, I can't tell you how many manuscripts I would have loved, but I simply can't afford it because you're charging £10 per page, which is like $20 Australian, and then you want a manuscript that's like 240 pages. Yeah, I can't afford that. So I would love to see that. I don't think that's going to happen. The other thing is, now a librarian could probably answer this better than I can. You see a lot of these manuscripts, yes, libraries get the manuscripts. It's their job to preserve them and make them accessible to the public and, keep them for historical purposes. But I see some of them and they're literally falling apart. The pages have all fallen out and they're in a terrible mess. And then they say, look, we can't photograph this for you because of the condition. And I can understand that, but being in that condition, isn't that even more reason why you should photograph it so you've got a digital copy? Be that as may, also, can't they get it rebound? I realise they try to keep things as original as possible, but when the whole thing's fallen apart, it sort of gets to a point, if you don't do anything to preserve this book, it's just going to be gone. And that happened in UPenn. They had a manuscript there, Codex 1669, a collection of a work of spirits and their sigils, and every manuscript, this was one of the Allenwick ones, every manuscript they had was uploaded with the exception of that one because the condition was really, really poor. And they did upload, there was a select pages, about 3 or 4 pages that were really cool because they were jet black. They're black as night, and they had these beautiful red sigils of spirits on them. Looked really kind of demonic. I loved it. It was so cool. And they uploaded photos of them years and years ago to one of their blogs, which reasonably good quality photos. Actually, no, I think the photos were actually loaded when they went to auction. Anyway, regardless, I saved them. And then down the track, I was able to get a photographed copy of that manuscript, and those pages weren't there. They were gone. They'd fallen out, and they were either lost or someone had stolen them. So thankfully, I still had those original photos, and I was able to digitally insert them back into that manuscript. So at one point, that digital PDF was the only complete version of that manuscript. I don't know if since then I found them and they've been put back in or whatever, but the point is the manuscript had fallen apart and the pages were loose, and that's how stuff does get lost. So that's always a bit of a concern. Now, maybe there's a reason they don't, whether it be cost, they don't have a good binder or whatever. So I just don't like seeing things get led to the point where it's just too far gone. But maybe I'm getting off the actual gist of that question. There's also a lot of libraries claim copyright on a lot of things, and they say, well, you can't do this or can't do that because it's copyright. And I'm like, well, dude, the author's been dead for like 150 years. I don't know how you can claim copyright on that, but they have these regulations and rules, so you just play along, otherwise you don't get anything. So my one grief would be, if I could do one thing, I would say make it more affordable to the general public. You have some librarians that are just crotchety old people that go away, they're not interested in you, but that's very rare. But I mean, I've met some really wonderful librarians as well. I remember when we were working on the Sibley Collabus all those years ago, I think I found one, I think it was the University of Michigan or something, and I contacted them and they'd request it, and they say, oh, look, sorry, we don't have a system in place. So I had to literally set my alarm for like 2 or 3 in the morning, wake up and physically call them and give them my credit card details over the phone and stuff like that, because they didn't actually have a process to do it digitally, and they hadn't set it up. And they were so wonderful and helpful, and it was really, really good. And it was a great manuscript too, so I was very, very happy. So you'll get some librarians that'll go above and beyond. And most of the times that's generally the case. They're really good. You'll get the occasional one, but most of the time it's good.
On the flip side, Daniel, and you already addressed this a little bit, but when it comes to researchers or casual readers, what could we do better to access manuscripts and interact with libraries,
The best thing to do if you're starting out is familiarize yourself with catalogs and working through catalogs, just being able to sort of navigate the online, isn't it? Some can be tricky, especially if you're doing the ones that are in foreign languages. I can only speak English. I can't read any other language. I wish I could, but I'm too stupid. So if I'm going onto a German website, for example, and you're looking through this catalogue of stuff, and it's like, it's all German, but you'll see words that you do identify, like magic, or magi, M-A-G-I-E, which is the same, in German as in English, kind of. So you can you pick out words and you identify, what's that? You click on that and sort of, But being familiar with how to navigate those catalogs is important, and they're all a little bit different. And sometimes some can be very user-friendly and some can just make you lose the will to live, So I think that's one of the big things. The other thing you've got to have, apart from keep wallets, which we've already discussed, is you've got to have patience and you've got to be civil and polite. If you're going to harass the librarian and say, I want this, or this photography isn't good enough, or whatever, they're just going to say, well, sod off. So I think that would be the starting point, is just getting online, learning how to extract stuff from the catalogs or the descriptions that you're after, and then learning how to fill the forms out and sending them off and stuff like that. That's basically it. At the end of the day, really, a lot of it is just, common sense.
Here's a listener question from McKinley Valentine that is an Australian-based question, which is, McKinley's asking, is there anything of interest to the occultists on Trove? And McKinley says, for other listeners, Trove is an incredible free online resource that aggregates a bunch of different Australian archives and libraries, has scans of newspapers going back to the beginning of European occupation, etc.
Unfortunately, much to my chagrin, when it comes to Australia, I've basically found nothing. I only know of one manuscript on magic that's in the University of Newcastle, which is a really nice one, actually, on talismans and Kabbalistic magics and stuff like that. That's the only one I've ever found. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of stuff in private libraries, in collections, private collections, but as far as the universities and stuff go, I've never found anything, unfortunately. And I have looked, there's plenty of early printed texts on the occult and esotericism and alchemy and stuff like that. But handwritten manuscripts, not many that I've found so far. I mean, there may be stuff that I've missed, I'm sure. You can never be 100% foolproof, and I'm sure there's lots of stuff I've missed. But in the searches I have done within inside of Australia, I haven't found anything other than that particular manuscript to date.
Daniel, what is one of the oddest places that you've ever found rediscovered an occult manuscript? Was there just a very odd or strange place?
Dude, I wish I could say I found something hidden in a secret drawer in the bottom of the chest. Oh, how I wish that was true. The oddest place. I don't know if I'd say oddest. I think I'm surprised at how far things can travel. I mean, we've talked about the Sibley Clavus in the University of Israel. That's a Victorian English manuscript in Israel. And you think, how on earth did that get there? And it's like the last thing you'd ever expect to find there. And like, I've seen so many of the Hockley manuscripts and all the other manuscripts just get dispersed around the planet. So they just turn up in places you just wouldn't expect. In the case of the Sibley Clavus, I mean, there was a guy, Abraham Shalom Yudah, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he was a collector who travelled abroad and then bequeathed everything to that university when he passed away. That's how it got there. But still, you think, wow, that has leapt literally from one side of the planet to the other. So, yeah, I haven't found any weird places, but definitely places far from their source.
Earlier, Daniel, you were sharing about some of these key players in the Victorian era, Hockley and Major Irwin and Moseley and, Hans Sloane and Lord Somers and Sir Joseph Jekyll, so many different people. But taking a step back, kind of broadly speaking, why do you think magic in the Victorian era, so roughly those 60 plus years of Queen Victoria's reign over Great Britain and Ireland from 1837 until her death in 1901, why is that era such an interesting time magically?
The serious scholars would probably dispute that, saying was not really that important because they're going back hundreds of years earlier to find the source material, which is absolutely valid and definitely important. So the stuff that was being passed around in the Victorian time was stuff that was already, it was nothing particularly new. But what was so cool about it was the amount of stuff that was being passed around. It was insane. And if I could live in the Victorian, I'd be so happy, because the amount of manuscripts that were being copied, being passed around, the amount of correspondence that was going on, the amount of these sort of fraternities that were being formed, and everybody was sort of networking back then as well. And of course, there wasn't the persecution that you once had. Everything was open. I mean, the Victorian England was still very sort of a Christian-based society, but, spiritualism and stuff was kind of like the in back in those days. So I think it was just important to give such a wide, varied example of material. It's like a smorgasbord. You just walk along and think, oh, there's that. I'll have that, oh, and that. So, I mean, just being able to walk into a shop like Denley's and pick up, necromantic manuscripts or astrological manuscripts or alchemy or whatever, just they're there. It boggles the mind, the amount of stuff that was actually being passed around. So I think that period more than any other was definitely the heyday of collecting, and maybe, the 18th century as well to some degree. There's some great stuff in that period as well too. So
to go back to something you said earlier, Daniel, speaking of in the Victorian era, you mentioned the Society of the Mercurii or the Mercurii, and just for the listeners who might not know, that is an occult magical organization that operated in London in the 1830s. Why was this Society of the Mercurii or Mercurii, why was it so important to esotericism?
Well, the Mercury, there's one of those sort of societies being speculated on and talked about for quite a long time, but at the end of the day, no one really knows a lot about it because it was a very secretive society. It was probably one of the first major sort of big societies of that period, and it had some pretty heavy hitters in it. And we spoke about Richard Cosway to start with. I mean, he's been sort of ear-tagged as one of the sort of founding members. He died in 1821. The rule was that if you're in the Society of Mercurii, you were never allowed to disclose that you're in the society. It was very much a secretive thing, and only after a person passed away was their name allowed to be sort of released, for lack of a better term, to the public. So a lot of the members that were in it have been a speculation through little tidbits of information and stuff. Some members did out themselves. Raphael, the first Raphael, which Robert Cross Smith, he was openly candid about being a member. If Richard Cosway was indeed one of the founding members, they had the foundation of his library. So they had excellent access to a pretty good source of material for them to work with. In the early days, though, the society was mainly astrological. Robert Cross Smith was very much an astrologer, and they were sort of more geared towards that. But as those early sort of members passed away or whatever, that shifted from sort of astrological to more spiritualism and slightly magical orientated. Hockley's often been ear-tagged as a member of the society, but I don't think he was. I think he certainly engaged with them. He certainly helped them. I bet that they most certainly would have approached him, members, and he may have injected more sort of magical elements into the society, but I don't think he was ever an active member. It's one of those sort of things that's just really cool. It's like one of the sort of first real sort of secret magical societies. It went on for quite a good period of time. I'm always trying to chase little tidbits of information on who may have been members. Some of the members went by the magical names as well, and so that makes it very, very difficult because you've got no idea who the real name was. So it's just a matter of keep searching and keep sort of scraping and looking, and correspondence also is a good source for information. I mean, letters and stuff like that, being able to go through those and get little hints like, okay. So and that's how we know the members of the Fratris Lucis, and that's how we know members of the Society of Eight, which was Mackenzie's organisation that he'd done a bit later on through correspondence. In fact, I have a letter from Mackenzie that actually shows the emblem that he made, his representation of his society. Oakley wasn't a member of that. He was an honorary member because he was too old by that stage and passed on shortly after, I think. So, the Mercurii are enigmatic, very cool, and a sort of a foundation for societies that probably came after it as well.
Even though it is a very secret organization, just having that historical context is excellent. And
yeah, I mean, I often joke about how I'd love to reform the Society of the Mercurii today, and I've talked to people about it. I thought, yes, we do that, but it was a different time. Unfortunately, it wouldn't work anymore because to be a member of that kind of society, you have to be very open with the information that you've got. And now in the world of publishing, and people are working on their projects and they like to keep them secret, even though I certainly understand that, and it just became more of a sort of a process of finance, people do it as a job or whatever. the society wouldn't work anymore. And I think with social media too, and sometimes egos can get in the way and things like that. So for a functioning society to actually work, everybody has to be on the same page, working together. Sadly, that's just doesn't happen anymore. But it'd be a cool concept all the same.
Can you share, Daniel, to that point about the Victorian era, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about, magic, esotericism, magical manuscripts, anything and everything in the Victorian era? Anything that you'd like to set the record straight on or share about misconceptions?
Well, there are probably serious historians that could probably answer that question way better than I can. But I think misconceptions, as I said earlier, it was still a very Christian-based society, and I think spiritualism and magnetism and all those kind of things and crystal gazing was probably people's main focus of interest during those times. Masonic lodges were huge back then. Fraternities were huge back then. So things were sort of more of like Irwin's Fratrus Lucius and Irwin's Book of Magic. It was very Masonic. You can see the Masonic trappings in it. There certain degrees, you see it in other manuscripts as well. I don't think there was a lot of actual Solomonic magic practice then. Certainly the stuff was passed around. Certainly people read about it. But apart from Walter Moseley, you don't really hear about anyone actually talking about summoning demons and spirits and things like that. And afterwards, probably there's some people that do it, but it was very much more sort of scrying and contacting the people that have passed on, and that sort of spiritualist movement was the thing of the day. And of course, you had all the periodicals being published, all the spiritual magazines and stuff like that. And a lot of those have been uploaded, and they're a great source for information. In particular, if you're trying to track down information on a particular individual, you can go through and you can see advertisements and articles that are written. And I've seen, multiple articles written by Hockley in the spiritualist journals, a little bit by Irwin, a little bit by Moseley. And it was the Facebook of the day, those journals, when they were passed around. So that's probably the biggest thing, the misconception I could probably think of off the top of my head. You see a lot of the sort of movies sort of depicting sort of all these sort of magic things in the set in the 19th century, but I don't think it was really that romantic. Be cool if it was.
So, Daniel, given this context about the Victorian era, something you've mentioned several times so far in the podcast is a fascinating, and at least to me, often overlooked aspect when it comes to books themselves and manuscripts and who owned the manuscripts. And that would be this concept and use of book plates. Can you share for myself, and I'm sure others who might have heard about it but not really know, what the heck are book plates? And are they the same thing as crests? How are book plates made? Why were they used? Can you just give us the Daniel Clark Cliff Notes on book plates?
Sure, absolutely. It's funny, when I say to people, you're talking about hobbies and things like that, and I say, one of my more recent hobbies is collecting book plates, and they're like, every person I say that to is, what the hell is a book plate? Because I think they have in their mind, they're thinking of like, I don't know, a plate with a picture of a book on it, or a metal plate or something like that. It's kind of like a hobby that is a mutation from my work with manuscripts, because over the years you'd get the manuscripts, and inside the front cover you would see there would be a little emblem pasted in, and it would generally be the owner's crest and name. And it was a thing that was done, it was kind of like a trend back in the day, that the people that had the large libraries would commission a book plate that would be their family crest and their name, and they were stuck in the book, so people knew that this book belonged to this person in this library. And it was a very, very popular thing. And you look at the newspapers, I've got a lot of the London Illustrated Newses from the 19th century. I love collecting those too. It's great. You can read about state of the art from 1851. And you see a lot of the advertisements in there for people, for businesses that request, you come to us and we'll make you your book plate and stuff like that. So it was a very much an in thing. But basically, there's a couple, like today it's not so common. People still do it, but there are two kinds of book plates. There's the sort of, I'm only interested in the 19th century and earlier, what they call an armorial book plate. And basically that just means the book plate that has a family crest on it. After sort of like the 20th century, people started to get more artistic, and you could basically just have any kind of pretty picture you wanted with your name on it, anything. So I'm not so much interested in those. Oh, they're lovely, and a lot of people are. My interest is merely in armorial book plates, in heraldry. So, yeah, I thought when COVID hit and there was that wonderful time where we were all sort of locked away in a box, I thought, I saw one online. I thought, well, maybe I'll just collect one. And they're kind of cool. I'll collect one. Oh, that's good. Maybe I'll get two. 3, 4, and now I'm up to about my 6th album. And spending obscene amounts of money on bookplates that I don't have. So the thing with heraldry is I know nothing when it comes to it. It is insanely complex. It is literally like learning another language. They have their own way of describing a crest, their own language to describe a crest. When you look at a bookplate, you basically, for people who may or may not be familiar with it, a lot of the time, for a basic kind of bookplate, usually you'll have a shield and a helm and maybe some mantling, and on that shield there will be other little images which designates the family line. And they'll be cross-hatched. There'll be lines, or there'll be dots, or there'll be sort of detailing to it, and each one of those represents a colour. I think cross-hatched that represents black, and another one, certain angled lines represents green and stuff like that. So you can learn all that as well. You can go right into it. I've got a book here that's just got a history of crests that's literally a foot thick. It's the most massive book I've ever seen, and that's not even touching the very tip of it. So it's like going into a whole new world when you get into that. So we won't get into that here because it's just mind-boggling. But yeah, so bookplates were basically the owner's crest in the front of the book so that people knew who that book belonged to. And the good thing about that is it makes my life, and anyone who's doing research, life very, very easy. If you find a manuscript that has someone's crest in it, well, you know where it's come from. It saves you a lot of legwork. They're also cool as a work of art. The person who was doing it would etch it or carve it into a copper or metal plate, and then they would strike that. So you would use that basically as a printing press, and they would print off that. So it was quite an art to actually carve all that. Because when you look at them, some of the line detail in them is incredibly fine. It's a lost art, I think. Well, now they probably just use computers and laser it in, but back in those days, everything was done by hand.
Would it be fair to say that, especially for someone like you, a manuscript seeker, a manuscript detective, when you see a bookplate, it also is a very important because it tells you about the provenance of the books,
Yes.
who owned the book, and you can trace that lineage. Would that be fair from what you're saying?
Absolutely. At least a part of its journey, depending on how old the manuscript is, you can see, okay, this manuscript resided in this collection for X amount of years and was belonged to, Sir William Bloggs, so it makes life so much easier. But you've also got to be wary as well, because the common practice back in the day too was to name an heir after the father. My very first bookplate I got was Lord Somers. And I thought, fantastic, this is Lord Somers. No, it wasn't Lord Somers. It was another Lord Somers. Not the one that we were talking about earlier, the collected library. It was another one down the line who had the same name. I've since found out that the actual Lord Somers that we did talk about does have a bookplate. That's an 18th century one. Sadly, it's extremely rare to get and quite expensive. Same as Harry Houdini. He's got a really cool bookplate. That's a modern one, but it's cool. It's just a picture of his portrait. Trying to get one of those is incredibly expensive. You've got Charles Dickens. I've seen his bookplate come up multiple times. I don't think I've seen it go for under £400. So, Charles Dickens was also interested in magic. I didn't know that. That was cool.
Charles Dickens, I had no idea. Harry Houdini, you've been blowing my mind with this. This is amazing, just to hear about the different historical figures that are known for other things, but their interest in magic or magical.
Well, that's the cool thing about this sort of journey, is that there were so many fingers and so many different plies and things, and you just little tidbits you learn along the way. So it's kind of cool, like the Joseph Jekyll and one of the unrelated Jekyll being friends with Robert Louis Stevenson and actually being the source of that name. And it's just these little tidbits on the side that you also learn, which makes it that much more fun.
Who was Sir Edward Denny Bacon, and why is he a good example of bookplates, stamps, and occult manuscripts?
Bacon, the master philatelist. Denny was mostly known as being a professional stamp collector. I think he also would help other people amass their collections and catalogue their collections. He was seriously into that. In fact, he actually became the curator of the Royal Philatelic Collection. Oh, I hate saying that word. It's such a weird word. He was very, very famous for that, so it's quite ironic that he would have a bookplate. But he was also, outside of that, and there's not that much information yet, although I need to look into it further when I get a chance, a very, very strong interest in magic, because I've seen his plate turn up in quite a few manuscripts, and they keep turning up. And when you actually look at the design of his bookplate, it's one of the very few, in fact, I think it's the only one that I've seen so far that actually has esoteric trappings. It's like the crest itself it's got the family crest, which is the boar, the pig, which is the actual crest for his family line, but it has an Ouroboros circling like a hexagram and other sort of esoteric code and symbolism, which is not common. So he's commissioned that. He's obviously been very, very interested or been involved with some sort of fraternity or some sort of magic-related sort of activities. So the only other one I know of, Chris, that has sort of esoteric trappings is Ashmole's, which is more astrological. It's just generally you don't see it. It's usually a family crest and that's it, because generally you have to be to get a crest, you have to be awarded the crest. Now you can buy them. You've got to apply to have for an official family crest. You've got to meet requirements. You've got to have done something to be worthy of it, and you've got to pay a crap load of money. And then they'll issue you with a crest, but they'll give you a design. They say, no, this is the one you have. You don't get much say in it. It's a very elitist kind of thing now, but back then it was sort of the same thing. They'll just do your family line crest and that's it. But he obviously commissioned this alteration to it, so it's cool.
One of the things that you touched on is your amazing collaboration with Dr. Stephen Skinner and working together, either authoring, co-presenting, editing manuscripts, finding manuscripts, and then presenting them through Golden Horde Press. To that very point, I think this is a great time to chat about a wonderful collaboration, which is Dr. Stephen Skinner and yourself presenting the Antipalus Maleficiorum. And I know many listeners are familiar with this, but for those who might be hearing it for the first time, the Antipalus Maleficiorum is a vital list of pre-1500 grimoires written 500 years ago by the very famous abbot Johannes Trithemius, the teacher of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus. And this list of pre-1500 grimoires is now fully available in English for the first time, thanks to yourself, Daniel, and Dr. Stephen Skinner translating and presenting this list. So how did you find, quote unquote, the Antipalus Maleficiorum, and how did this whole project first come about?
The Antipalus, I think that's one of my most favorite names. The Antipalus Maleficiorum, it just rolls off the tongue. I love it. Well, I'd looked at the Antipalus before quite a bit, actually, in regards to its list of manuscripts and sort of spent some time seeing if I could track some of them down in the past. And then when we were working on the Stenographia, it just seemed like the natural sort of next step, being that it's another book that Prometheus is most renowned for. And because I'd already done a little bit of previous work trying to locate a lot of those manuscripts that are on that list, it just sort of came together and it was a fun thing to work on. The problem is that a lot of the stuff in that manuscript list, we know some of it is, and a lot of it we still don't know. It's sort of yet to be discovered, or the name has changed since that. So that can happen a bit as well. Even though we've published it, it's still an ongoing work in process, just trying to locate where all these things have gone. But what a fantastic list, and what a very daring thing to do. Basically, Prometheus, he made this list. It was probably the first list made publicly of grimoires and books on esoteric magic and whatever. Not really something you should be putting out at the time that could potentially get you killed. But in fabulous Prometheus style, he'd done it in such a way that he was condemning them. And as many people have said before, he would basically go down the list and give his comments on them and say, oh, well, that book is an abhorrent, a travesty to God, do not touch it, it's profane and disgusting, and whatever language he would use. Of course, the worst, most heinous kind of response he'd get to the text actually meant that that's the one you need to be looking at. And even if he did mean that, it's still going to have the same effect, because it's like putting a big red button in front of you and it says, do not press. If you put a manuscript in front of me with that sort of response, I'm going to have a look at it. I'm going to have to try and find it. It was a very, very interesting sort of move on his behalf. Great work.
Joseph H. Peterson has talked about this as well on esotericarchives.com. But as you just touched on as well, Daniel, that this catalog, it's so important because it sounds like, tell me if I'm understanding it right, I mean, it really presents on a variety. Trithemius shares on a variety of subjects. So astrology, demonic magic, right?
It's a smorgasbord. It's a wide range of different sort of, dare I say, genre, for lack of a better word. But I was determined, obviously there were printed versions, many, and been printed for a long time, but I was determined to try and find a manuscript version of it. And that was my thing. I really, really wanted to find a manuscript version. And I actually did find one in the University of Cornell. It's a 16th century one. Reportedly, it was copied from an original in the library of, he was an elector of Brandenburg, and apparently it's a lot more complete than a lot of the printed editions. It has lots of additions and stuff in it that the printed editions don't. So it was a really, really good manuscript to use as a base. And thankfully, Stephen can read it. I can't because I can't read Latin. But it was great to actually see a written one. Printed works are great and they're important, and I understand that. But I've never really been into printed material. I've always loved manuscript and source material. And even if it's copied from a printed thing, I still love it more because someone's taken the time and the care to do it.
Trithemius, of course, originally wrote this. It had been printed many times, but how did you stumble across or find or track down this specific manuscript? Were you on a specific hunt for it? Was it unexpected, or what happened with that?
Yeah, no, that one I was on a specific hunt for. I knew Cornell University, or I probably went through my sources, because I knew Cornell University has some great stuff. I mean, I got their experimental book from them a long time ago, and I gave that to Nick from Enodia, and he used it for one of his publications. That was a great Faustian work. That's such some cool stuff. They actually got some pretty good collection of what they call their witchcraft collection. And they've got some other stuff that I want to get commissioned to be photographed in the future. But I did find the Antipalus there, and it was bound in with this other work, whose name I don't recall now, a large Latin work. And they actually, when I ordered it, they actually sent me the wrong thing. They actually sent that part of the manuscript, not the Antipalus. So I had to email them back and say, look, sorry, you've made a mistake. You've sent me the wrong part. And they said, oh, very sorry, we'll send you this. So I ended up getting the whole thing, which was great. I would have gone through that and just found it in there and then like, holy crap, we need this, we need it now, sort of things. Yeah.
Listeners, check out the links below, of course, to order your own copy of the Antipalus Maleficiorum presented by Daniel Clark and Dr. Stephen Skinner. And speaking of these collaborations that you and Dr. Skinner keep having, Daniel, which is wonderful, and speaking of the Victorian era, there's another one that you and Dr. Skinner are both editors on, which is a Victorian Grimoire, The Master Key to Ancient Mystery, or known as The Master Key, a remarkable and detailed Victorian grimoire by W. H. Ibbott, or Ibott. I know you will correct me very soon. And this is a Victorian grimoire which contains almost all of the magical currents in the Victorian era without any reference to stuff that came later on, like initiation and the Egyptian gods, which were introduced decades later by the Golden Dawn. So listeners might be hearing about this for the first time. So can you give us, Daniel, some of the context? I mean, what is this grimoire? How did you track down this manuscript from just seeing its name in a catalog? I mean, what was going on here? How did this come about?
But it's okay because I say Ibbott as well, so I'm probably pronouncing it wrong as well. So don't worry. I've had this manuscript for a while now. I've been sitting on it for a while. I discovered it in the University of Manchester, a couple of years ago, a few years ago actually. The description was so cool, and I thought, this just sounds so awesome, but it was expensive. It was really expensive to get that photographed, just shy of $1,000 Australian. So it was a lot of money, so I had to save up for a while to be able to get it. And in the interim, I'd done a little bit of research on it, but not a lot because I was doing other projects. And I get sidetracked. I'll find a name and think, oh, that's good. And I'll start looking at it, and then I'll get sidetracked with something else. And then I'll come back to it. So I'm very disjointed in the way I do things sometimes. So anyway, I eventually ordered the manuscript, and they sent it to me, and like, holy crap, man, it is beautiful. The amount of work and time that has gone into the creation of that manuscript is mind-boggling. Absolutely mind-boggling. But the weirdest thing about it, and if anyone who's seen the original, is that, and I do not know what failed him to do it, but Ibbott decided to scribe the entire thing on this sky blue paper. And it made it really hard to see. It was like, oh man, you've just got this beautiful, beautiful work of art, and you put it on, that sort of bright blue sort of coloured sort of paper. And I thought, oh no. So I actually ran the entire thing through Photoshop, and I removed all the blue from the paper, so it looks like just like any other ordinary manuscript now. But I've referred to it before as the Magus on steroids, and that's what it reminds me of, because it is basically a complete course of magic. Just about everything you would want is in it, and it's set out in such a way that it's so clearly explained and beautifully presented that it is the perfect sort of grimoire for someone who's really seriously into practicing magic. And so I had it for a while, and in between, while we were waiting for stuff to be done in other areas, I said to Stephen, I showed it to him, and would you be interested in this? And he said, yes, we'll do it. So I was really, really ecstatic with that. we didn't have a lot of time to spend on it because we had so many projects going. So it is only a bare bones kind of publication, but it's just, I think it's important for everybody to see because it's so great. I may cop some flack, there not being a transcript. That's on me. People can blame me for that. Now, the reason being is I was born in 76, and at school we were made to write cod cursive, which is an incredibly watered-down form of calligraphy for a little while. Then that's sort of gone out the way, and then it was just normal print. And, writing is very, very basic now. So calligraphy is kind of a dead art. So a lot of people, myself included, struggle to read calligraphy from the 19th century. And if it's in another language, forget it altogether. When you're trying to read Hockley, like, oh my God, it does my head in trying to read his handwriting. It's very difficult. Irwin, I can read it a little bit, not as complex, but as difficult. But with the Master Key, to me, it is the perfect book for anyone who wants to read calligraphy. You've got to train your eye and sort of get your mind into it. And I thought this is the perfect sort of text for anyone who wants to sort of learn how to read calligraphy to be able to practice on, because even I can read it, and I'm, if excuse expression, I'm crap at reading in calligraphy, but I can read this one. And so I thought, no, don't get a transcript with this one. Let people sort of use it, practice on it, and learn, because it really isn't that difficult. It's so clearly written. So I thought that's kind of like, it's a good entry level for people who want to get into reading period manuscripts. Learn on that one, get your eye trained, maybe move on to something else, and hopefully if you're a lot better than I am, you can probably read some of the Hockley stuff and further on, because one of the other things I love so much about grimoires is the beautiful calligraphy. Beautiful calligraphy. Black letter German is fantastic, but my God, it might as well be in Egyptian. French flamboyant sort of calligraphy is just a joy to look at. Sadly, I can't read it, but I enjoy looking at it. The Ebert manuscript is definitely up there as one of my absolute favourites, as it was a pleasure working on that.
As you were saying, it's effectively a complete course in magic, and it also includes beautifully drawn sets of the 7 planetary spirit, sigil, angels, intelligence seals. Wow. Yeah,
it does. And there are variations in those I haven't seen before. Now, I don't know whether Ebert took sort of artistic license with those, but they're beautifully drawn. It really is a great work. And interesting, there was another, at the same time, I also got another manuscript photograph from Manchester, and it was one by Barrett. And it was a very short, simple manuscript on scrying with crystal. Again, I think, I forget the title of it now, but I've got that at the same time. Maybe I add that to a work as an appendix in the future.
Earlier in the podcast, Daniel, you were mentioning that it's so important not only to rediscover manuscripts, to find manuscripts, to translate manuscripts, but also to talk about the people who owned the manuscripts and the occult libraries of nobility, if you will. And you've said that, quote, "As anyone who knows me can testify, my interest in the occult sciences is not only limited to the grimoires, manuscripts themselves, but also the libraries they came from and the absolutely fascinating individuals who either collected or compiled them," end quote. And so to that point, one of your future projects, looking down the road a little bit, is what you might entitle the Occult Libraries of Nobility, a reference of grimoires from the past to the present. This sounds like a fascinating project. Daniel, can you just give us the broad strokes? What is this about, and how did this whole thing get started?
Originally, when we were doing work on the Antipalus, I was doing a write-up, following up on manuscripts and things that were on that list and stuff that I'd done in the past. And so I started doing a write-up in regards to that, and I guess I kind of got a bit carried away, and I wrote too much. So I sent it to Stephen, and he said, "Oh, look, why don't you do this as your own work, as you put out your own book using this?" And I'm like, "Oh, really? Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, just do it." So I thought, okay. It was originally meant to be in the Antipalus, and then it kind of splintered off and become its own separate entity. And that's what I've been working on and off on over the last few months. So basically, to cover everything I would want to cover would take me massive volumes and probably 2 lifetimes. So I've picked out more of the sort of major collections, not the smaller ones, the major collections. And what I've gone and done is I've just basically given a brief history of the person whose collection belonged to, and then I've reproduced the catalogues, whether it be the auction catalogue or a listed catalogue or what they had or whatever, an exact facsimile of that catalogue, with the hopes that basically people can use that as a reference and use it as a jumping board for their own research. So if you wanted to see a book that was in Hoppy's collection, you could go in there and think, okay, there it is. Okay, now I can probably go out and try and find it. If like I've listed where it actually, if I know where it's located, I've listed it so people can go straight to it. If I don't know, then that's a job for someone else to help me try and find it, hopefully. Incidentally, there were 2 Hockley auction catalogues. I didn't know this until a while back. There was one that probably most people have seen, but then there was a separate one, and that had all the really cool stuff in it, because I often wondered with the first one, there was so much stuff missing. And no, it was actually in the second auction catalogue, which is like, wow, that was fun to go through. So, yeah, basically, I've gone through and I've listed all the catalogues so people can just use it as a quick reference and basically use it as maybe a head start on their own personal research. That's my hope anyway.
How many people are on your list of manuscript collectors?
I must confess that I've been a bit slack with it. Every time I saw a name, I would write it down, but I haven't done that in a long time, so I will need to go back and update that list. But I think last time I checked, it was over a couple of hundred, and that's just really concentrating on the 19th and 18th century. Most of those people didn't practice magic. They just had a magical manuscript in the library. Maybe they only had 1 or 2 manuscripts, but they still had them. So I make a note of it. And others obviously had heaps, and others were practitioners. So it's an ongoing list. I don't think you could ever complete that task, really. And the thing is, and that's the problem when you're working with people with the owners and working with manuscripts and people who use them or whatever, is a lot of the time it can only be speculation, because there's very limited information. Unless you've got concrete evidence, you can only put forward a hypothesis and hope that you can prove it down the track or whatever. So it is, a lot of time it's a guessing game. That's the problem with anything with history. Unless you were there, you don't know.
We will certainly keep our ear to the ground on that, Daniel, because that sounds like just such a powerful project, because you're documenting it, tracing the lines of transmission, the cross-pollination, and just sharing about the people who owned those manuscripts. That is so wonderful. Can you share, Daniel, speaking of collaboration, about the importance of working with and teaming up with scholars, authors, and researchers, especially in today's day and age, with like Joseph H. Peterson, David Rankin, Dr. Stephen Skinner, Mihai Vartajaru, Daniel Harms, Brian Johnson. I mean, there's so many amazing, bright minds out there. Can you just share about the importance, from your perspective, of collaborating with all these different scholars and researchers?
There's so many awesome people out there doing really, really fantastic work, better than what I could ever dream of. These people on cutting edge kind of academic, you go-to people when you want to learn stuff. They really are. So, I mean, as I said before, I'm so honoured and blessed to be able to work with Dr. Skinner. I mean, I really don't know how he puts up with me, but it's just an absolute dream. He is so good to work with and just so kind. Collaborations are very subjective. It's up to the individuals. I think it's a great way of doing the work. I mean, instead of tackling it all by yourself, you've got 2 heads, maybe 3 or more, working together, to produce a single product that's going to be, really, really good. You've got different angles. Some people might think about something that you don't think about, or in different ways. Everybody has different ways of approaching research that have their own sort of stuff that they can pull in. And, as long as they're all bringing something to the table and you're working together, you'll end up making the load a lot less for yourself and getting something that's probably a lot superior than you could do by yourself, But and in saying that, some people love working by themselves, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I say to anyone out there, if you ever get the chance to collaborate with someone, please do. All the stuff I've worked on, I'm a student like anyone else. I'm learning as I go along. I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm doing, and I learn as I go along. And, and that's just the way it is. You can never, ever reach the end of this journey. You can't. It's just ongoing. So it's really, really good practice, I think. Also, though, I think it's important to be aware of unscrupulous people. And I've had incidents in the past where people have said things and then not followed through. So there is that thing. But I think 99% of the people are fantastic, and collaboration is always fun.
Speaking of this history, Daniel, of the Grimoires, we have a listener question for you from Glitchbottle patron Damian Gordon, who is asking and saying, The rarity of first-person written historical accounts of people actually using the grimoire manuscripts always stands out in my mind, with a small handful of notable exceptions. And so Damien is asking, is Daniel aware of any manuscripts of magicians' personal records of operations that may not be known about widely, that he would be willing to share about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the stuff by Dee and that's everyone's familiar with. But it wasn't really, to the best of my knowledge, a common practice. I mean, when you were talking about periods where just owning a grimoire could get you killed, having a written account of you working with it really would be the nail in the coffin, I would have thought. And then the grimoire itself is a written account, really, when you think about it, of instructions. You follow that, there you go. You know, you don't really need to write it down because it's there. But writing stuff down is something that's sort of come much later, I think. Simon Foreman, I think he used to write stuff, but that was more medicinal. I know there's a lot of his records, and I haven't gone through them because his writing is horrendously hard as well. So I think he used to document stuff, but he probably got away with it, again, because it was more of a medicinal nature. But I haven't come across handwritten records, certainly not from earlier periods. And they may be out there and I just haven't found them, and might be someone listening who says, well, hey, I've got these. It's certainly possible, but yeah, it's not something you readily come by.
As a follow-up to that, Daniel, we had another listener question for you from Damien Gordon, who's asking, does Daniel think the lack of these rare first-person historical accounts is because we simply haven't found these manuscripts yet, or it was genuinely very rare for people to put the grimoires into practice and then record what happened? And it sounds like it really was, from your perspective, definitely more rare.
Well, I would have thought so, being rare. I mean, yes, they were definitely working with these books, and they were practicing experiments, doing so at great risk of being found out. So I think to increase that risk by writing a document talking about how you've just summoned a spirit to, kill your neighbor's cow was probably not in their best interests.
Touche. Very, very well said. The bovine must be protected. Yes, I completely agree. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about manuscripts, the Victorian era, anything we've been talking about? And looking to the future, are there any other hints that you might have for us on upcoming projects or collaborations or research? Anything at all?
Well, I've always got something on the go, Alex. It's just trying to find all the hours in a day to try and get all this stuff done. I mean, and you never know what's over the hill. You never know what you're going to discover. I'm always on the hunt for new manuscripts and stuff which could potentially be published in the future by Golden Horde or such. And I mentioned earlier that I've still got a Faustian text I'd like to try and get into print. There's certainly a lot of Hockley stuff I would love to do. But I'd also, down the track, like to get into some of the Omniodo stuff. There's manuscripts in Japanese, unfortunately, attributed to Abe no Semai. And he was kind of like the Japanese equivalent to Solomon. He was a master astrologer, and he could divine, and he could command spirits and stuff like that. It's really, really cool. However, my knowledge of Japanese is zero, so that's going to be a hurdle I may look at in the future as well. But no, I think it's just we just sort of trudge on and try to find what we can. And there's so many wonderful people working with it now, and probably now more than ever, there's so many eyes in the sky, so to speak, looking for stuff. So the chances of new stuff coming to light is increasing with more and more people getting on social media and online and searching. And so I'm always looking forward to the fabulous stuff done by, people like Joe Peterson and David Rankin and Mihai and all those other fantastic scholars. It's always a pleasure to see what they're doing. But more than anything, Alex, I would like to thank you, because I think you really deserve more credit than anyone, because you're actually bringing this stuff. You're disseminating this information to a wide audience. And you're really good for motivation. Like sometimes if I'm feeling a bit flat or unmotivated, you'll send me a message and it just sort of lifts me and keeps me sort of, yes, I need to get moving on this sort of. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. Well, the honor is certainly mine, Daniel, and I have so enjoyed, and I'm sure the listeners have as well, talking about esoteric manuscripts, the Victorian era, bookplates, collaborations, upcoming publications. I cannot thank you enough. Esoteric manuscript detective, researcher, editor, and collaborator, Daniel Clark. Daniel, just thank you so much for taking the time and generously sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it as well, and I hope that the listeners enjoyed it. So I really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Listeners, I hope you appreciated that chat with Daniel as much as I did. I had no idea about the richness of the Victorian era when it comes to the practitioners and also the volume of manuscripts, but it was also so cool hearing Daniel's tips and things that we can all do when it comes to searching online catalogs and just familiarizing ourselves with how you can find manuscripts and how you can go through the collections. I'm also super excited for Daniel's further research into the families and the nobilities that actually possess these manuscripts over the centuries. So check out the links below to order your own copy of the Antipalus Maleficiorum, as well as the Victorian Grimoire with Ibit as well. Really, really fascinating things on the horizon. And as always, a huge thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. If you'd like to join as well with exclusive perks and be able to ask guests questions, check us out at patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.